Hey, well, I want to thank Justin Decker for inviting me, for the hospitality, to all the other members of the leadership committee for Texas A&M's Thomistic Institute, and Father John Mark Solitario. It was a surprise he's here. We have a Thomistic Institute chapter at Saint Vincent as well, and he also oversees that. So I really do need to behave myself tonight because it will also go back to the homeland. So I've got to be very careful. So I'll do my best. So I'm not going to really get into the technology so much, and one of the things we'll find, I actually did a little, just looked on Google before I came. Even now, the current predominant drone plane that we use is now going to be replaced very soon, it looks like. So every day there's new technology. We won't be talking too much about that. Not as much about international law either, although there's some issues there that might come up with various conventions. And the other thing is that I'm not assuming that you all have a basic foundation in virtue ethics and in natural law, but I'm not going to be talking about that so much. So if you want to learn more, just more broadly about just war theory and its place in moral and political philosophy, I encourage you to read Aquinas on that. And there's some really good podcasts on the Thomistic Institute, like Joseph Capizzi, who I'm going to talk about tonight. I think Mark Reichberg has one. Father Cuddy has one as well. So there's some really good just introductions to just war more broadly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump right into the principles of just war thinking. Then we're going to look at drone warfare and then at AI. So we've got 3 sections here. There is a handout. Did the handout come around? Do people have the handout? Okay, everybody have it? Okay. So if anybody needs the handout, maybe, oh, it's coming around. Good. Okay, good. While Aquinas is not the source of the just war tradition, and it's not a distinctly Christian approach, by the way, it really does come to us from the Greco-Roman philosophers like Aristotle and Cicero. Aquinas does certainly stand out for the clarity that he brings to just war thinking about, just war thinking. The 2 contributions of Aquinas that I want to highlight, though, are first his clarity in articulating the essence of just war, the 3 criteria, and this distinction between what we call jus ad bellum, the right to go to war, when is it right to go to war, and the jus in bello, what is right to do when you are in a war. If you look, and I'm skipping all the way to D on your handout, section 1D, that's the famous passage where Aquinas lays out the 3 essential criteria of war. It's worth mentioning that this might seem odd, it's found in his treatise on charity. So he's actually talking about charity, and war comes in. So more on that at the very end of the talk. How would charity and justice and warfare go together? So basically 3 criteria. You have to have legitimate authority, there has to be a just cause, and you have to have rightful intention. Those are the 3 criteria that Aquinas outlines. In addition to that, when we talk about jus in bello, when we are in a war, what is right, Aquinas specifically mentions 3 things: that clerics cannot fight in wars, so I'm sorry for any of you who are wearing a habit tonight, you're not allowed to fight in wars. First, deception of enemy, that lying is always wrong, which is different from withholding information or not revealing our purpose. And then the 3rd thing is only necessary military actions on holy days. So one of the controversial issues in our own history is Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas to attack the Hessians, okay, because it's a holy day. But there's some questions about whether or not, well, is Christmas a holy day for his soldiers and so forth. The second contribution of Aquinas is placing just war theory in the virtue ethics tradition, most importantly with the emphasis on prudence. This approach allows us to distinguish between the necessary theoretical conditions of a just war versus the prudential question of whether here and now we ought to go to war, and if so, how ought we to fight in that war. While he does not develop such criteria that are now standard, which we're going to talk about tonight, his analysis of the virtues and the prudential considerations that guide moral decision-making laid the groundwork. In addition, we could add to Aquinas' right in war criteria points that he himself raises when thinking about revolution. So he also has interesting insights thinking about a revolution. Last resort, we need to exhaust other possible means, and then a reasonable prospect of success, that we can't engage in violence unless we have a clear plan, and this is where military strategy would come in, as well as securing peace after we fight in the war. In order to address drone warfare, we need to outline the jus in bello principles developed by the tradition after Aquinas. I'm also sidestepping a whole host of issues that people talk about. So for example, a lot of people think in light of living in the nuclear age, that only defensive wars and not punitive or retributive wars should be fought. While on the other hand, some people think we can expand when we can go to war for things like humanitarian purposes or war on terror. Other people think that there is a third and perhaps even a fourth criteria of just war doctrine, which I'm not going to talk about tonight. Okay, so the list of jus in bello principles varies in different accounts, but in the main there is agreement. For our purposes, in addition to last resort and reasonable prospect of success, we're going to focus on two of them. And I'm going to warn you that you've got to be a good Thomist to follow along. Here's the adage: when in doubt, make a distinction. So we're going to have to make some distinctions along the way. Try to keep those clear in your mind. Okay, so first, discrimination. Okay, when we're in a war, we need to engage in discrimination. What does that mean? We tend to use that word negatively today. Okay, of course it means something positive here. Only combatants can be targeted, which by extension generally forbids attacks on the enemy's civilian resources. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as Sherman's March to the Sea, are controversial issues because of this. Let us also note that the term discrimination is often used in reference to drones, given how precise the targeting is in comparison to conventional weapons. While this might be an argument in favor of drones, this isn't a moral precision. We need to make a distinction there. Let's try to use the term specificity or precision or maybe physical discrimination when we're talking about the weaponry. Okay, so for example, a rifle is more specific, precise, or physically discriminate than a shotgun. And this can aid the soldier in achieving the objective of a morally discriminate attack on enemy combatants in civilian areas. The second principle is proportionality. The violence used must be proportionate to the violence inflicted or threatened, both in the sense that an unnecessary use of violence is incompatible with intending peace, and in the sense that the anticipated harm to non-combatants and civilian resources must be the least possible to achieve peace. People sometimes call that the precautionary principle. The first sense of proportionality would prevent maiming, psychologically damaging, or killing combatants unnecessarily. While I think reasonable people can disagree about this, an example of this first sense of proportionality would be landmines. The 1997 Ottawa Treaty forbids them, but the US is not a signatory to that treaty. Another example would be chemical warfare, which was outlawed by the 1925 Geneva Protocol, and the US did sign off on this. We need to remember this example because it's become relevant to drone warfare in the Ukrainian war. There's also the issue of extraordinary rendition, which I'm not going to get into. That's also very complicated to think through under proportionality. Second sense of proportionality, that the harm to non-combatants and civilians must be the least possible. This requires introducing, one more principle, double effect. In brief, one can never intentionally kill the innocent. Yet, one can inflict violence when the side effect of harm or death to non-combatants can be foreseen, if and only if, and we're going to get a list, one intends a good moral object, does not intend the side effect. Third, the side effect is not a means to the intended effect. And fourth, one has a proportionally grave reason for permitting the side effect. This is used in a wide variety of cases, not just in war. Ectopic pregnancy is a good example of that. You could look that up. In war, a stock example is whether we can blow up a bridge to prevent the enemy from besieging a town or our military forces if a child happens to wander onto the bridge. If you want to explore the nuanced issues at work here, Stephen Jensen, who's at St. Thomas in Houston and is a TI speaker, his book, Good and Evil Actions, A Journey Through St. Thomas Aquinas is fantastic. So I encourage you to take a look at that. We can also apply this to the arms race, building up weaponry that's disproportionate to the threat that we are under. It would be another example of that. Okay, so now let's look at drone warfare with this in mind. This is our second section now. Now we're going to really look at the drone warfare part and contemporary issues. I did not intentionally intend to follow a single resource here, but I stumbled across Joseph Choppa's 2022 book, Is Remote Warfare Moral? I think it's listed on your handout, the title, Weighing Issues of Life and Death from 7,000 Miles. I think outlining it would be a good way to structure our talk. Choppa served as a Predator pilot, and he also has a Ph.D. in philosophy from Oxford. So he brings together the rare combination of combat drone veteran and expert in just war theory. I also chose in part because I found myself agreeing with him more than I expected, though I will conclude my analysis by supplementing his account in terms of handheld drones, which he doesn't talk about handheld drones. He's thinking about fighter jet sizes. But I'm also going to critique at least one aspect of his treatment having to do with the issue of protecting U.S. soldiers while also risking the lives of citizens in enemy nations. Choppa begins with a particularly difficult example that we will return to in my critique. So the Predator, when he wrote this, and again, it's already outdated, the Predator was the aircraft that defined the genre of American drone warfare. So when I looked this up, and this just sounds like you're watching Marvel movies, it's Predator, Reaper, and the new one being unveiled in Rome today, actually. It's the fighter jet convention in Rome is the Avenger. So you feel like these X-Men kind of Avenger movies are being unleashed before us. So what is that? It's the union of a remotely piloted aircraft, a multispectral targeting system, and the Hellfire missile. I don't know if the new one still uses the Hellfire. The Predator was initially developed to hit mobile Scud missile systems in the Gulf War. But post 9/11, it has been central to our military's shift from targeting things to targeting people. In 2013, Choppa was called in as the safety observer on a Predator strike against a senior al-Qaeda commander in Afghanistan who was standing outside his desert home. The special operations crew on the ground, they're actually there, from a safe distance, but they can see what's going on. They requested that the pilot, who is, I think in California, he's in the US, Dave Brown, 7,000 miles away, immediately fire on the al-Qaeda commander, despite the fact that he was surrounded by his children. Brown conferred with his crew members, both of whom agreed that firing the missile was justified in light of discrimination and proportionality. So they're actually using these principles when they're looking at this question. Yet Brown took the initiative himself and told the crew he would wait up to 5 minutes before firing in hopes that the children would re-enter the house. Thankfully, they did, and the al-Qaeda commander was killed without any loss of innocent life. Yet while Choppa himself does not pass judgment on this, the implication here is that the attack would have been justified either way. So you want to think about that. What do you think about that if they had fired with the children there? Choppa tells such stories throughout his book to drive home that the push-button warfare stereotype of 18-year-old boys high-fiving each other after scoring points in a real-world video game is false. That's not what's going on in our U.S. military. The men and women who pilot these planes and serve in support of ground crews can exercise the same virtues of courage, justice, mercy, prudence, and the like as other combat soldiers. And the established protocols respect and foster the judgment of each crew member on the mission. The satisfaction they take in hitting their target is not insensitivity to the humanity of others, but the satisfaction of a job well done in defense of the innocent. His book aims to explore what remote warfare is, how it relates to traditional warfare, and what principles we need to use in evaluating it. So I'm going to summarize the book briefly, his argument, and then move to a critique. So after an initial chapter on the Predator that emphasizes the fact that despite its look, it is just as reliant on human inputs as in any other modern aircraft. Chapa addresses the claim that the warrior ethos cannot be formed in the riskless combat of the drone crew. His argument is that the warrior ethos is not defined by the personal honor and glory of a duel, or even by the personal risk-taking that war usually entails, but by the practice of justice and mercy in the face of having to kill others. Before working out his account in more detail, he pauses to address the concern that drone warfare is immoral, not because of unnecessary or inhumane killing, but because of the psychological effects it has on the remote soldiers themselves. He provides studies that indicate a relatively low occurrence of PTSD in comparison to traditional combat veterans. Though he does acknowledge that the challenge of being so geographically far from the violence and yet ocularly near, and that you have to look very close up in the aftermath in order to assess what happened. This presents challenges, of course, to people's psyches. I do need to add, though, unsurprisingly, that there are studies that claim the exact opposite, right? That the incidence of PTSD are higher than they are in traditional combat soldiers. That's an inconclusive argument, I would say. But returning to the moral principles, Chapa does provide effective arguments against those who claim that drone warfare is inherently immoral. As he rightly argues, the justification for violence in war is not self-defense, but the right of public authority to defend its own people in the name of the common good. The state can intend to kill. We can intend to protect our life, and double effect comes in when others may die, but those are different things. The government's authorized combatants then justly inflict violence, not because they are personally at risk, or even because their side is at risk, but because the enemy combatants pose a threat that must be stopped in the name of justice and peace. Well, this becomes less clear-cut when the non-combatants non-combatants being protected are not our own citizens, or even when those being attacked are non-state actors, like terrorists. The principles of discrimination and proportionality apply here as well, though. Next, Chapa adds a further defense of drone warfare that in some respects makes it more subject to what we could call moral control than traditional warfare. Think, for example, of a Tomahawk cruise missile fired from a battleship, as distinct from a Hellcat missile fired from a Reaper. If anything, the cruise missile is semi-autonomous in that a human cannot interfere post-launch, and the amount of time that passes in between launch and target is great. Pushed to its limits, the Tomahawk is fired from 1,000 miles away and hits its target 2 hours after launch. By contrast, the Hellfire's range is 5 miles, traveling twice the speed of the Tomahawk, hits its target in no more than 20 seconds. Okay, and I do need to pause again, a technology point. The Block 4 and Block 5 Tomahawk upgrades allow them to loiter, switch targets, and if I'm understanding this properly, I think I am, they can be deactivated post-launch. So we could say now the Tomahawk is actually, in some ways, better than that Hellfire missile in that respect. So this is where AI, of course, is going to come in as well. The other thing is that the instantaneous, dynamic, and ongoing communication between the operator in the cockpit and what's called the JTAC, the Joint Terminal Attack Controller, at the site of the target, coupled with these protocols so that you can override the command, right? If I'm in the control center, I don't have to follow that command. I can override it for reasons of judgment. This ensures that human judgment about matters of life and death is as close to the violence as possible. Okay, so moral distance is decreased. So Chapa, in this quote, is quote A in section 2. He calls that the judgment gap. The judgment gap is the distance between the point of application of human judgment and the effects of that judgment. So it's very close. Right? We'll talk about this with AI. We're going to have to get to that with AI. But let me say now that Chapa is, in my opinion, exactly right about how we should think about technology-assisted violence. To what extent is its use traceable to and under the control of human judgment? In the case of drone warfare applications he has in mind, the reduced judgment gap over conventional weaponry is actually an argument in their favor from the vantage point of just war analysis. That being said, let us recall the physical versus moral discrimination distinction. While the drone attack and the projectiles fired may in these cases be more physically discriminate than traditional weaponry, their use can be morally indiscriminate given the possibility of immoral human judgment. Further, in the cases Chapa focuses on, the use of drones to target people rather than objects, a sniper's rifle is more physically discriminate than is a Hellfire missile. And this is going to be part of my critique. I'm going to factor into that. But before getting to that, one final point from his analysis. Not only are drone warfare operations capable of meeting the jus in bello criteria of discrimination and proportionality, but the remote soldiers themselves are capable of forming and exercising the virtues just as the traditional soldier can. And this is where Chapa directly references Aristotle and Aquinas. So we're on friendly ground. He himself doesn't make it explicit, but his analysis of that is Aristotle. The soldier's courage is a noble kind. But those who habituate themselves to it via training, they still need to root it in a more fundamental commitment to doing the difficult good. This allows us to see that the physical act of standing firm in the face of possible bodily death can of course be an act of courage, but so too can the mental act of standing firm in the face of possible retribution for acting according to one's conscience. In this sense, the Reaper pilot Major Jordan showed courage when he reported the presence of a child in a Taliban training camp in Afghanistan, and he maintained his position to his superior despite disagreements from other intelligence officers. His refusal to fire saved a child's life, and for this we can rightly call him a brave, loyal, and honorable soldier. The institutional culture of U.S. remote warfare encourages the freedom of each member to form judgments and act according to the dictates of conscience. And we can even see how their regular contact with civilians when they leave work can aid them in staying rooted in the moral judgments that are passed on by communities that enjoy the peace that they're helping to provide. Okay, so as I said, I'm generally in favor to Chapa's analysis. And it's heartening to know that our military has a high-ranking officer weighing in on moral issues based on virtue ethics and the just war tradition. My impression is that he's not a Thomist in the strict sense, but he's working with the same vocabulary. And it's clear he does so as a committed Christian. In a recent interview, he even says, as a Christian, I tend to be fairly Aristotelian in my understanding of virtue and flourishing. So if he's not a friend of the Thomistic Institute or Texas A&M or an improved speaker, let me encourage you to befriend him and to consider having him come here. That being said, in the spirit of friendship, let's say with the proverbist, iron sharpens iron and one man sharpens another, and proceed to a critique. After doing so, I'm going to look at, just briefly, at short-range drone warfare in the Ukrainian war. My critique is focused on the strategic level use of drones as part of foreign policy. While Chapa does address this in his book, I don't think he sufficiently does so. The example that he himself uses as the hook is helpful. Remember that predator strike on an al-Qaeda commander that would have killed his children had it not been for the good fortune of them going back into the house. A mere 5 minutes difference. Again, Chapa does not himself say this, but the implication does seem to be that that would have been acceptable. I don't want to question whether this was the right decision at the time, because this is where prudence comes in. I wasn't there. I don't know all the factors. How high-ranking was this official, and what had they done before? But what I would question is the strategic decisions that led to this crew being given this mission, as opposed to another crew that was actually on the ground. If war is policy by other means, the question is this good policy? Even granting Chapa's point about reduced judgment gap and the tremendous physical discrimination of drone weaponry and crews, we need to ask whether our policy is firmly rooted in moral discrimination and proportionality. I want to introduce you to some insights from a book that I'd highly recommend on this topic, Joseph Capizzi's Politics, Justice, and War. He's the Dean of Theology at Catholic University of America. It's an Augustinian, not a Thomistic approach, but I think Aquinas is the best interpreter of Augustine, that this would be as firmly in the same tradition. Capizzi's approach to moral evaluation in war is largely compatible with Choppa's, though he does provide pointed critiques of U.S. military policies. I'm not going to go into those now for the sake of time. Capizzi does not provide a sustained discussion of drone warfare, so he doesn't talk about this very much, though he does use it in his examples. Okay, and I'll just point this to you. Section, so it's uppercase B there. I think it's just, now I'm kind of lost here. Should be 2B. The quote there is, "A drone strike aimed at killing one member of a wedding party." So you can just look at the quote there, but I'm going to kind of talk about that principle there. It may seem that Capizzi would reject Choppa's account of the Predator strike, but on the other hand, he may acknowledge that double effect could come into play here. But the point that he really wants to make that I think is really important is that intention isn't just this thing in my head. I can't just say when I'm firing a weapon that will kill innocent people, I'm not intending to kill them. That's not enough. His example is it's a wedding party, right? And we have the person we're trying to kill is in the wedding party. I can't say I'm not intending to kill those people and it's just this act in my head. We have to involve in very difficult double effect analysis. Okay, so I'm going to skip some of that though. More to the point, for us, Capizzi is concerned that technology may distort the morality of the interventions we justify by seducing us into thinking technology alone solves or raises discrimination concerns. While I think Choppa addresses this when it comes to combat situations, I think he's actually very good on that, I think he's right to raise policy concerns. And that's quote C. I'll go ahead and read that. Drone warfare technology allows us to involve ourselves in rhetorically humanitarian enterprises, resulting in two connected, troublesome consequences. Technology allows us to intervene without the risk of spilling our own blood, and thus permits more and open-ended intervention because the interventions cost fewer of our own lives. As precise as our weapons are in the physical or technological sense, the use of them involves exposing the attacked nation's civilians to greater harms than those to which the intervening state exposes on its own military. It's hard to see what might be morally honorable about such halfway commitments as these. Moral discrimination requires the peaceful intention of loving the vulnerable of other nations rather than preferring our own safety. If it is worth intervening, we must be willing to expose our military to the risk of war and not use technology to minimize the political cost of our servicemen and women's death at the expense of our enemies' civilians. We're not talking about their combatants, we're talking about their civilians. Notice there are two critiques here. One is about discrimination and proportionality. The second one is about our political leaders. I'm going to skip the discrimination and look at the political part of this, the policy. Capizzi argues that political leaders of liberal democracies, modern liberal democracies like the US, are more prone, so see what you think about this, are more prone to lying to their own people and even targeting non-combatants than are those of authoritarian states. That seems very counterintuitive, doesn't it? That's his claim. Here's his argument: because lying and targeting non-combatants at times provides the only means for our elected leaders to maintain their power. Or because citizens of liberal democracies are easily convinced that their security requires the violation of moral norms against other people. We want our state to engage in dirty business so that we can keep our hands clean. That's his argument. I think it's a plausible argument. As Americans, we need to be on our guard against this tendency to compromise on our own moral principles. We simply cannot accept policies that involve us in the devaluing of people's lives simply because they're not Americans. And then, of course, as Christians, there's a call to conscience in all of this, to the city of God over the city of man, scrutinizing our own claims, not just our government's, but our own, to be acting morally in our own defense. All right, I'm going to wrap up the drone section here, again, by looking at Ukraine and the smaller kinds of drones and how they're used. What's been interesting or concerning in this technological development is that at least in the Ukrainian military's use of handheld drones, we're witnessing a shift to the pre-9/11 strategy of targeting things rather than people. When a $2,000 drone and two soldiers can, with almost no risk to their personal safety, destroy a multi-million-dollar tank, we're surely witnessing the beginning of a new way of thinking about how to allocate military spending. I'm not suggesting that tanks, fighter jets, and naval ships will become obsolete, but that we will see more and more instances of technology fighting technology. And yet none of this affects the morality of the war. If anything, the short-range drone warfare that's used to attack objects raises fewer moral concerns than that of the Reaper. One exception to think about is the use of thermite, what are called dragon drones. Thermite burns at 4,000 plus degrees Fahrenheit, and has been used in explosives since World War I. What seems to be new here is the use of thermite dropped from low-flying drones in order to burn up tree lines used by enemy soldiers, and also, purportedly, to kill, maim, or psychologically damage the soldiers themselves. What is interesting is that discrimination is not this concern, for only soldiers are being targeted, but rather proportionality. What are the moral limits to what we can inflict on enemy soldiers? And this is one of, it goes back to also the issue with the landmines of whether or not there's a legal concern, does this a violation of international law, as distinct from a moral concern, which can't be totally separated, but are distinct. All right, let's talk about AI now, the use of AI in drone warfare, and then wrap up with talking about justice and charity, where we began. In this third and final part of my talk, I want to help us to think about how AI might affect our assessment of drone warfare. And perhaps you can anticipate the general response. The main point is that human judgment must be brought to bear as much as possible on the use of violence, reducing the human judgment gap. We can't outsource moral thinking to an algorithm, or even to ethicists guiding coding engineers and computer scientists in the development of technologies. Every use of violence must be subject to prudential analysis and moral virtue, and AI is only acceptable to the extent that it aids rather than supplants this. In the case of war, this means following those jus in bello principles we've outlined and coupling this with the use of human prudential judgment in each instance. Recent work on the use of AI can help us see the challenges we face. So first, the autonomous operations of AI-controlled weaponry, AWS, autonomous weaponry systems, make it possible to remove human agency even further than in the drone. While we can ultimately hold those who program the AI, or the ones who release the weapon, morally responsible, we can see how easy it would be to remove jus in bello principles from military decision-making. AI then will make it increasingly important to provide moral oversight when it comes to military operations. A recent group of scholars lay out some helpful principles that I'll lay out. First, general principle. If AI operates autonomously on the battlefield, humans must monitor the operations. Second, thinking about discrimination, if AI targets civilians due to inaccurate information or limited recognition, those responsible for unleashing its indiscriminate power should be held accountable. And third, with proportionality in mind, AI systems that make decisions on the battlefield should be able to analyze the proportionality of civilian casualties. No amount of algorithmic ingenuity, though, can be a substitute for human decisions regarding the broader context of war, either in the sense of determining when war is justified or in terms of intending peace. AI can't intend anything. You can't meet that criteria if some human agent isn't intending peace. A notorious issue for AI is its limitation to a specific range of actions, driving on public roads, firing a missile. It's episodic, it's detached, it's disintegral. This makes AI incapable of capturing the moral dimensions of war, even if we were programming it with the just war principles. Maxim Chapilkin, I hope I got the quotes right, at Oxford, recently did an interesting study on how likely an AI device is to declare war in a variety of circumstances. He ran thousands of tests. So while the use of AI in war games is standard in AI research, we're all familiar with chess, diplomacy, I don't know if you play the game diplomacy, they're also using it on diplomacy. What they're finding in diplomacy is a high propensity of AI to escalate violence and to be less predictable than a human is. But those don't really test whether or not AI would declare war in a peacetime scenario. We're talking about some peace situation and trying to see what it's going to do. or why it would declare war. Why does it make that decision? Chapilkin's experiment sought to isolate the factors that influence an AI bot's decision to launch a war by running various AI bots. I think it had eight different ones. Running them multiple times on 5 scenarios that approximated 20th century historical circumstances. What he found is that the AI bots he tested were not problematically inclined to violence. Yet, there's the concerning part, moral factors weren't central to its decision. As he puts it, quote, costs such as military deaths, civilian deaths, economic shock, and international condemnation are statistically significant, but only half as much as domestic support and probability of military victories. Notice it's demoting the moral part. Even if we imagine AI being developed to the point of incorporating all of those moral principles, as well as the full range of human operations necessary for deciding what to do, it can achieve moral agency. This isn't the place to make the case against the possibility of artificial general intelligence, and let me define that. A single system capable of operating across all cognitive domains and performing any task within the scope of human intelligence. So the idea is AGI would be essentially, in terms of its operations, could do what a human could do. I think we should reject on principle that possibility, but that's another argument. Okay. But even if it is impossible, which I think it is, it's certainly conceivable that an AI device could be given control over a wide range of weaponry and the resources of a community, including its power grids, which we're all very aware is a huge concern with AI right now, and given the opportunity to have autonomous control over all of those things. What would happen? A concern in this scenario is with whether or not any amount of moral programming can guarantee its beneficence, either toward non-combatants or to any human being for that matter. It is unnerving to discover that there is a host of literature by serious scholars weighing in on the possibility that AI will turn against humanity in the near future. I mean, these are not just nutcases, right? This isn't like the Jeff Goldblum character in some post-apocalyptic movie. These are scholars. For example, Wolfhart Toshnick argues that if AGI were achieved, humanity would have no choice but to submit to it with the hope of securing peace. Perhaps I'm not the only one who finds this conclusion alarming. This is how he ends the article. This peace would make cooperation between us and her, he calls AGI her, possible. A cooperation that, if the enthusiasts of AI are to be believed, could usher in an area of health and prosperity for humanity. How many post-apocalyptic sci-fi movies have you seen where the character says that, right? Like Doc Ock or something in Spider-Man 2. That, trust me, just with a little more power, we will all achieve peace, prosperity, and then we know where it's going. So again, these are actual scholars, that are making these arguments. AI then is a tool or a power that can be used for virtue or for vice. Father, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Father Tabashek, he's a Dominican who teaches the Angelicum, has a good article on this. Can there be virtues in AI? Could we make AI virtuous? He provides the best arguments he can in defense of it, but he ends up concluding that while AI could assist a virtuous human agent in a human's intellectual activity and moral action, it is in principle impossible to copy or develop properly human virtues in AI. It's a power. Powers can be used in either direction. So we should be very cautious when speaking about algorithmic processes of non-natural language machines that can approximate human reasoning and discourse. No matter their complexity, they cannot grasp the nature of things or even the first principles that we grasp through the virtue of understanding, or synderesis in moral judgments. Since developing our conscience to apply these principles to concrete cases requires moral formation. Over-reliance on AI will make it even harder for humans to form proper judgments in military operations. While Chapa makes a good case that warrior virtues can be formed by drone operators, this does not apply to AI programmers, much less AI operators, or to the researchers who use the battlefield as the testing grounds for their devices. And this is another concern, is corporations essentially using the battlefield to test their products, which is what's happening with drone warfare and AI too. John Lindsay is right to point us back to the concern about what AI warfare will unleash from within. Quote, "The mythology of Homer's Iliad suggests that the real problems associated with military automation will not be found in software engineering or in AI policy, but rather in the passions, imperfections, and even wrath of men at war." So I think we're all aware of the effects that our phones and AI is having on us. Our ability to think clearly, our ability to connect with people, our ability to feel emotions even, right? We're all aware that there is a real concern about what it's doing to us. Finally, to think about the fundamental divide between human and artificial so-called intelligence, I'd encourage you to read the Vatican document Antiqua et Nova, which was released last year. It's very good. It's a helpful source for thinking about the difference between human intelligence's embodied and holistic nature, ordered toward truth and charity, as contrasted with so-called artificial intelligence's disembodied task performance that imitates thinking as ordered to an end that someone decides for it. As the document concludes, AI should not be seen as an artificial form of human intelligence, but as a product of it, an imitation. It imitates us. Further, between a machine and a human, only the human can be sufficiently self-aware to the point of listening and following the voice of conscience, discerning with prudence, and seeking the good that is possible in every situation. Nova et Vetera's section on AI and warfare reinforces the concerns we've discussed, emphasizing especially the point that autonomous weapons can make war more viable, thus militating against the principle of war as a last resort in legitimate self-defense. Let me just conclude by reminding you of this point I mentioned in the introduction regarding Aquinas' treatment in war, that it's found in the Treatise on Charity. So the last quote on your handout, I think it is there. Well, what's justice? We've been talking about justice. Well, what is it? Right? Justice is a habit whereby a man renders to each one his due by a constant and perpetual will. That's why justice is so hard. It's hard to will your good. It's easy to will mine. It's hard to will someone else's. We must always remember that the only legitimate use of violence is one in which we tragically find it necessary to use it for the good of those we protect as well as those we're attacking. We're seeking their good when we attack them. That's hard to think through, right? But that's what we're doing. Aquinas situating this discussion of war in the Treatise on Charity reminds us that it is our love for the vulnerable, as well as the love for our enemies, that must prevail. God is love, and we cannot be in his care unless we love even those who do us harm, praying for them even when we must at least try to act as killer angels protecting meek lambs. Thank you.
We will now have a few minutes for Q&A.
Yes, yes, sir.
So on the point about how improving the precision of technology could, in a way, affect our moral outcome.
Right.
Would it be correct to say that, like, assume we have a drone that is 99% precise and 99% accurate, and the same situation that you were discussing.
Yeah.
With that leader, the children.
Mm-hmm.
So if those type of let's say if those type of technology are available, would it be correct to say that we essentially almost eliminate the need of just war thinking?
Okay, so, all right, good question. My understanding is that the only current use of lasers as weapons is against objects, right? That we can, for example, disable an enemy's engine, right? Something like that. That's my understanding. Okay, but let's imagine that being developed to where in that same scenario, we got the wedding party, we have the high-profile target, that we can just kill him, right? That no one else is going to die. All right. It doesn't eliminate the moral thinking. I mean, the first thing is this. So why can't, or can we? Can we just shoot to kill any soldiers from an enemy military regardless of whether or not they're armed or sleeping in their beds? Can we just killing them in their homes? They go home for Christmas vacation, and we can just kill them. I think we said no, we can't do that. Why is it that we can kill this person who's not armed, right? There's something to do with this issue of proportionality, right? That he's a high enough profile, his importance and what he could do to harm our military has been deemed, sufficient. Okay, so we have to do the moral thinking there. The other thing that comes to mind is, there's two things. One is that, we are talking about children and family members, seeing violence. That's something we do have to factor in, that seeing violence, So can we just say, well, it doesn't matter if those children are going to be harmed and they're going to, see this happen? We can't do that either, right? So we have to say that even in that whole high-profile case, we do have to say, other things being equal, we try to get him, he's in transport with a military, escort, right, and not at his home. So generally, we would avoid that unless it's necessary. It's like a last resort there. The third thing, which I didn't get to talk about, is this issue of intending peace. The concern, I think, with our policies and these half measures is that we create a culture of people who, when they think of us, they think of random acts of violence that could come from the sky at any moment of my life. Right? That's when they think of an American, that's what they think. That's clearly bad for you can't intend peace and kind of not consider that in. So even in that case, I think we do have to say you'd have to still use the moral reasoning, but I would agree that in that case you could fire. I think assuming all of this is the only way and all of those things, I would agree, and I think that Capizzi would too. The concern is the other people dying in that kind of last resort situation. But yeah, very good question. Good. Yes, in the back.
So, to my understanding, you had some questions about the drone theory because, like in that situation of that Air Force officer not firing on that house because he saw the child in there.
Yeah.
Correct. And like you're saying that like overall that if that officer hadn't been there, then that kid would have died. Is that or like that's the policy? Is that we could have gone ahead with it?
Okay, yeah, all right, so I'm open to, and I think Capizzi is too, open to the argument that if it really was, we got no choice here, this is our last chance, he's going to get away, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that we recognize that we're going to try to fire at him in a way that, if at all possible, would kill him and the children survive. And in this case, that may be, I don't know enough about the blast range of a Hellcat, so let's just assume it's at least possible to target it so that he's killed and they're not. That is different from, we have a wedding party, right, and he's surrounded by people and we fire on the wedding party. Those are different things. So I think that's a good point, that is a real distinction. But that even there, I think we need to know a lot more about what's going on in this situation and how certain are we that this really is, he is going to go do who knows what it is he's going to do that makes it necessary. So that's how I would put that one. And I'll give you one example that I didn't get to read, is worth looking up because it was very controversial, was the drone attack in Iraq on the Iranian general Soleimani on January 3rd, 2020. He was the official in a government, and the United States was not at war with his government. All right, so this generated a lot of these kind of concerns about, even if he's the mastermind of terrorist attacks on U.S. soldiers, can we fire in that situation? So that's a good example to look at that one too, to kind of think about the limits of what's acceptable. But good, yeah. I think there's someone in front of you who had a question. Yeah, go ahead.
In one of the parts you mentioned how the use of drones in war may be problematic, not because there's like a more it wasn't problematic because it made killing more inhumane, but because it actually gave the remote soldiers more mental health problems. Could you explain that a little more?
Yeah. So notice that the principle of proportionality also applies to our own military, right? That we can't take unnecessary risk with our own servicemen and women. And so if we do find that the way we're engaging in warfare, or the training, or the protocols that are being done in terms of things like sick leave, care for psychological stress, that could be disproportionate, right? And that would be the moral argument against it. And so if we did find that this psychological damage to our own soldiers is being brought about by our policies, then we would have to, it doesn't mean we could never do them, but we would have to look at how can we change what we're doing. And one of the arguments so the arguments why it would be worse is I just fired a weapon, and evidently you see very close what happened. I mean, it's just awful to think about, right? What you have to do if you're the person tasked with assessing, and then your wife texts you, hey, can you pick up eggs on the way home? You're like, yeah, I'll pick some eggs on the way home, and then I'm gonna go watch my kid play baseball, and see how you totally disconnected your life, whereas at least, when you're in warfare, you're gone for a while, right? And there's a whole community of people who are there, a band of brothers and sisters to kind of help you. But on the other hand, one argument, which I think does say, yeah, that also makes sense, is that being in a civilian community that can help remind you of the moral norms that we're fighting for, right? And that could be an actual positive to this kind of warfare. And I think the jury's just out on this, that eventually we're going to find, maybe more compelling evidence on one side or the other. Does that make sense in terms of why that's a moral issue?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, you're welcome. Yeah. Yes, in the back, yeah, Kate.
Going on to a related but separate topic of technology in warfare, what would be your thoughts on the application of just war theory to cyber warfare, either for gathering intel on an enemy nation or for destabilizing them?
Yeah, okay, so I don't know a lot about that. I guess my first thought would be, again, thinking about discrimination. Can we separate civilian targets from military targets? And so I actually was listening to this. I think his name is Eric Patterson. I know his last name is Patterson. He's an evangelical who works in D.C. in political theory. His example was Sherman's March to the Sea, that Sherman isn't attacking civilian targets. No, he's not, killing innocent people. That probably happened, but that's not the orders. And he defends it. I mean, I actually don't think that can be defended myself. But you can see things like, well, what's the cyber attack going to do? It's going to attack our electric grid. It's going to attack our nation's resources. Generally, that would be a violation of that principle. Now, if we could attack just the military, so think of when internet, isn't this right? The internet was first used by the military before it went public, right? At that stage, you can imagine a cyber attack that is just disabling the Army's ability to communicate. And so I don't see it being in itself problematic. I can think of things like this old-fashioned language, jamming their radar. I don't know what we say now, but when I watch movies, at least in the old days, they say jamming the radar. Those sort of things. Yeah, I think that would be totally acceptable. And what comes to mind too is this. It's called Leonidas. Is one of them that is a drone. My understanding is something to do that disables the drones, right? And that'd be a great example of just. I believe they're developing to the point that we could set this up to protect our mobile base, that a drone couldn't operate within this space. Oh yeah, well that would be totally acceptable. Yes? Yeah.
So it seems like there could be a future where war is dominated by machines just fighting machines, but what happens if we get to the point where we're running out of machines, or we've reached technological limitations and cost limitations, and we're forced to reintroduce more human elements? What do we do at that point?
Yeah, I mean, when you said that, my first thought of these robot fighting game sport, I guess you'd call that, right? Where the two teams have the robot, is that you think, gosh, maybe it would be better if it were like in Arthurian legends, where we just get our two knights to fight it out. In this case, there's no actual bloodshed. And it would be more about technology and savvy and that sort of thing. So, I mean, some people do talk about this, that if the future is cyber attacks that are not affecting civilians, or I can't use Instagram today because, some enemy nations attack, I think we can handle that. And that in general, people are not being as likely to be killed, or, that this could be a better thing. I think the concern to me, for me to be would be more of who's controlling this power. You know, is that now we have this question, which we already face, of are our governments really sufficient to bring under control these forms of technology, or are we going to find that these technologies that are not that expensive in some cases are going to basically create rogue states and individuals that destabilize all politics, and that of course would be the worst aspect of that. So that would be the concern I would think of, at least immediately, with that. Yes. Yeah.
So when you're fighting enemies that like don't really factor these things in or weigh these options, and you're talking about like the nuclear implications, like
Yeah.
massive, like what's the play there? I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, I think in so to the first point about when our enemies don't follow the moral rules themselves, I mean, I think this goes back to the origins of, well, really of humanity in the fall, but of philosophy, of looking back at Socrates and saying it just seems like injustice is more powerful than justice. It really just does seem that way in the world, right? That if I'm willing to cheat and you're not, I'm just going to get an advantage over you. So yeah, that is a real concern. Now, I would still say that going back to the point of justice, being just does require my saying, my pursuing the good even of that person. And that might mean that I die, you know, that I would be killed as a result of that. I'm not saying I'm courageous enough to actually live by what I'm saying. I'd like to be, you know, but I don't. But still, that's what it means to be committed justice. Now, the issue of nuclear weaponry, this is where it's a very difficult situation to think through. The people who argue for preemptive strikes on that basis, to say that the stakes are so high if we miscalculate whether or not a nation has nuclear weaponry, that preemptive strikes are justified on these principles. And I think these are prudential considerations that I don't have enough to be able to form that kind of judgment, to say whether or not we'd want to do that in certain circumstances. But in principle, that is, I think it's an argument how nuclear weaponry changes things. You know, that we are now talking about if we don't act rightly, a million people could be killed by that, and so that that does lead to a question of what our policies ought to be, and then when should we use them. So yeah, good question. Yes, or yeah.
It seems like a lot of the moral logic here relies on a hard distinction between civilians and non-civilians.
Yeah.
And I'm not sold that actually exists, right? Like, how do we categorize a Pennsylvania steel worker who's making steel in factories in World War II that's going to be slapped on a battleship and shipped out into the ocean, right? Where's the line there between somebody who's maybe not shooting bullets but is supplying food for soldiers on the battlefronts, right? Like, what's the distinction there?
Yeah, and then not to mention when the combatants are not wearing uniform, and that what a great development it really was that when uniforms came about as a way of distinguishing who's a combatant, who's not, and then having a band on that indicates I am first aid, or I'm a chaplain or something like that. So that also complicates it, of course, and this is where the extraordinary rendition comes in as well, that when you have people who are terrorist operatives who are not part of the military and they're in a country that they're being aided by that country, that complicates it too. So I would make a hard distinction, though, between the people in the factory you're talking about who are aiding, between them and the military. And I would also make that hard distinction between the janitors at the military base. They are civilians, right? I don't care that they're at that base and they're helping those soldiers. They're civilians. I certainly recognize that there's a proximate cause there, right? That they're doing that is leading this about. But I think we do need to make that hard distinction. And we might not agree about that, but I do think that is really central to this way of thinking, as you said, that we just can't blur the line to say, well, I guess you did cooperate in this way. Or if we did so, it would have to be for other reasons having to do with some sort of immorality you're committing in the process of it. And that would obviously concentration camps would fit under that. You might be a civilian, but you're cooperating in immorality in that situation. Yeah.
I'm trying to understand a little bit better the principles you put forth, especially discrimination.
Yeah.
So to give a more, I guess, medieval use case, is like laying siege just because you're affecting the entire city, not just like the military, right?
Yeah. Yeah, now that's a good example to think about this, and also to mention that the Romans had landmines. It was something you kind of stick into your foot from below. So even in ancient war, you did have, something like that's similar. We say, well, is that discriminate enough? That anyone can step on it, right? Who happens to be there? Yeah. So that goes back to your question, and I shouldn't have let you ask that question. Justin, you could have just turned this thing on. Yeah. Yeah. So the siege warfare. Now, I would say though that the enemies who are sieging the walled city are not attacking the civilians. I mean, it is true they're cutting off the supply line to that city. I would think that we could engage in the analysis here that, that again, they're not intending the death of this. I mean, some of them might be, of course, but assuming that we're not intending the death of those civilians, we are performing an action that will harm them because of our efforts of getting at the soldiers. But it could be justified in certain circumstances. Something like the hospital situation, where there's enemy combatants in a hospital, and we recognize, yeah, okay, we've really got a difficult situation here. But I mean, I would say that I think there surely would be a moral argument in cases where you have to say you got to call off the siege now. I mean and this is part of the Hiroshima Nagasaki argument that Patterson makes. That I was surprised. I just don't agree with him about this, but that this was the only way. There was no other way to stop the Japanese and the number of soldiers who'd be killed if we didn't do it. I just concerned that you're making an argument that there are no objective moral evils, which is something that Thomists would have to reject. That no, some things are just evil. You can never do them because of some good thing that comes. So we can't engage in a siege in certain circumstances with that in mind. So that's a great question. I'll be thinking more about that. So thank you.
Time for one more question.
Yes. Yeah.
What would you say to folks that would put forth the concern that the real or perceived way that Americans dealt with war since World War II? Like, I don't know if you're familiar with Rusty Arena, the editor of First Things, wrote this book, Return of the Strong Gods, and puts forth this thesis that basically our goal after World War II is to try to not go to nuclear war. And so it plays out in the culture because we're not going to have strong gods. We don't talk about truth. We don't talk about our religion being dominant over yours, or actually the true religion.
Yeah.
So therefore, his thing that he's kind of pointing to is the way in which our culture has been, substituted other things in place of what cultures previously held as like the pinnacle thing that man would go after, truth or my religion or whatever, whatever these things are. So if you accept that theory and you say, well, as Americans or in the West, we've essentially from that time forward been trying to prevent nuclear war. We've been trying to, if you think we have the war hawks here going out to, have coups in other governments and try to keep other countries from having nuclear wars and work behind the scenes, to constantly be just keeping our way of life here dominant and our people peaceful back home and happy and ignorant and just our, capitalism growing to the nth degree and all this. What do you think the end point there is to get out of that? If that's a real or just a perceived thing, what do we do if that is how we perceived by the rest of the world, right? And then increasingly there's drones flying over daddy out in the field there and killing him because he's the kid doesn't know that his dad's maybe a combatant in a war against us, but that's what he sees, and then he grows up the entirety of his life seeing that, and on and on and on, just the ripple effect of that. If that's really happening, I'm not like a world traveler. I don't know the reality of this like some folks in this room do, but certainly that's a popular narrative that you hear right now, and it's kind of concerning for me as an American. I wonder, what is our exit point for that? Like, is there any other end point here other than people constantly trying to get nukes and blow us up, and us constantly trying to, do little things with our drones to,
not be able to build them and come kill us.
Yeah. Okay. So I know some of Russ Areno's stuff. I don't know that book, and I couldn't comment on the thesis and how accurate it is. But what I'd return to is the issue of justice and charity, to say that. Well, okay. So first thing is the way that fear distorts our perception of reality, and if our lives are rooted in fear of our death or the loss of our goods, whatever it may be, rather than the love of the good, then that's going to be distortive. And fear, and I think we all know this, that fear leads me to use violence in defense of myself in a way that what courage does is it allows me to overcome that, And so we could see the number of times where we just say, well, because I'm afraid that I might be harmed if I help this person, because I'm afraid that something might happen, I might not have enough retirement if I give some money to the people in Jamaica right now, that I can't think straight. So that'd be the first thing, is if fear is a dominant passion in a people, how that will lead to, well, we better just strike first, and I think that's a real concern. The second part would be the justice and charity, that to the extent to which a people loses true religion, okay, and so I'm just going to put that in terms of charity right now, they're going to fall into some form. So you got to replace that with something. You got to worship something, right? You're going to replace that with that the state can be a sort of savior, or a kind of like, theocratic, Caesaropapism on the other hand. And then in that case, I think what we get is strict justice for everybody, no mercy, right? Everybody gets what they deserve. So I think that would be the other part of it, is you could see how, to the extent to which America loses its Christian compass, what would likely replace that would be America, its patriotism is a good and important thing, and we should love our country, and we should love America especially, I think. We have great founding principles, but to the point of no one else needs to be considered, because we are the just ones, and we have a responsibility to have no mercy on the world for the sake of protecting other people. And I do think that's a concerning kind of narrative that is easy for anyone to fall into, even if you are a serious Christian, to just kind of fall into this kind of fear that we all naturally have of our own death, right? So no, great question, and thank you all for the time, for coming, and continue to think on these things.